Now you're welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown, the podcast looking at the stats and XG of Celtic FC. On last week's show, we ended on a fairly bleak note that Celtic may struggle to get past St. Johnstone, and sure enough, they didn't. Player fitness, player character, and lack of creativity again called into question by Neil Lennon after the game. There wasn't enough support for Edouard up front, he said. Call me crazy, but I think the five men in midfield, two of which are defenders, two of which were centre defensive midfielders, and leaving the striker up front by himself might have something to do with why the striker looked like he was up front by himself. And maybe I'm alone in this, but I thought that it was part of the coach's job to actually get the players in shape in the first place. But what can you do but get on your Zoom meeting and have a little chat with the board about how you're going to carry on again next week. Jaco James and Alan Morrison are on the line with me as always. Guys, how are you doing?
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So,
as well as can be.
Wish this was some good football news to cheer us up, but hey, we've had a glut over the last few years, I suppose. So
we'll get through
rough for the smooth.
We'll get through 2020 as 2020 was. So, as I said last week, we finished the podcast. James, you especially were worried about the St. Johnstone game, and sure enough, it ended in a 1-1 draw.
Yeah, it's the formula to play against Celtic is pretty well known, I think, at this point. So St. Johnstone has, as I mentioned last week, has actually underperformed their underlying performance statistics. So as I mentioned, they're kind of third in the XG table if you compare chance quality versus chances surrendered. And I think most people wouldn't think that, obviously, given the where Hibs and Aberdeen and the actual table. So, the question always falls in is that due for mean regression, or is maybe they just have a bad keeper, which seems to be the case. Their keeper play has been really poor this year. And maybe some lack of finishing. Yeah, exactly. Not great striker play. So that's part of it. But, as you kind of interplay that with Celtic's problems and chance creation, as I mentioned last week, that continues to be, in my mind, as important, if not more important, than the issues we've had defensively, which have been egregious, obviously. But a lot of that's been error rate rather than structural. On top of, some of the fullback issues that we've talked about. So it was just more of the same. And if you look at Edouard, I actually looked at this yesterday. The number of touches, and Alan would know this better anyway, the number of touches he's had in the box this year is down, I think, almost 50% or at least 40%. So it's just starved service and just complete lack of cohesion going forward. And Lennon's talking about it. Again, he clearly sees it. It's obvious. I mean, everyone has to see it. It's a question of, banging your head against the wall, keep doing the same things and not really changing anything of substance, in my mind, to try and address it. Like playing, two strikers in a two-striker system would be a place to start for me.
Yeah.
I think something we can maybe touch on in another one is that whole wide play, because if you play the 3-5-2, then obviously your wide creativity is going to come from those wide players. And if those, as we pointed out a couple of episodes ago, if those wide players are actually Frimpong and Laxalt, as much as they're entertaining to watch, and in many respects, their career creativity statistics are incredibly low, and there's really not much evidence, especially with Laxalt, he's 28, 29, that that's really going to change. And if you compare that to a Celtic setup that, for example, has Sinclair on one side and Forrest on the other, and you're looking at perhaps 40 goals there, to a situation where your wide players are probably going to contribute 5 total, then that's a huge hole to fill if you're going to play that system. Mm-hmm. So he's playing short of a deck on that one. But having said that, as you opened the show, and this is all. These are all Lennon's problems to solve. They're his team. He's had a number of transfer windows. So how's he going to fix it, right?
Yeah, and we broke down a lot of those stats, the XG off our fullbacks getting forward and their distribution into the box in previous podcasts. If you want to listen back to any of those podcasts, we're on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, anywhere you want to find us, we're on it. And you can listen back to our breakdown of all the different positions that we've done the defender so far. We've done the wing backs. We've done Celtic compared to last year as well. That was last week's podcast. So if you want to get up to date on all that, you can go back and listen to those podcasts. Today, we are talking about goalkeepers, because one name that has kept creeping up in these podcasts over the last couple of weeks has been Fraser Forster, and how much we're missing Fraser Forster. And I think that's evident when you look at the European games, when you're playing a subpar goalkeeper. That's when it really matters. So, Alan, what key performance indicators are we looking at here when we're talking about goalkeepers?
Yeah, I mean, this, actually, believe it or not, goalkeepers, despite the fact obviously it's a unique position on the field and they don't touch the ball very often, there's quite a lot of data you can collect on them, and they'll probably collect more data points on keepers than any other position, bizarrely. So there's a few, but let's hit on some key ones. So if we were doing this on Sky Sports and they were gleefully enjoying the fact that Celtic are struggling, and they'd probably show you a chart that was something like basically save percentage. So off shots on target, how many are being saved. So what I've done is I've looked at really the last 3 seasons. So I just want to recap, because the goalkeeping journey has been a little bit convoluted over the last 3 seasons. So just to try and put this into context. In 18-19, Gordon started off as the #1 goalkeeper. He started to show what I believe you would really call kind of natural age regression, similar to what we're seeing with Brown. His form deteriorated, and Rodgers brought in Bain. So Bain played most of the second half of the season. In fact, I think they played pretty much 50-50 across the season. Now, Gordon played all the European games and Bain didn't, so that's going to have a bit of an impact on the stats. But essentially, Bain had a tremendous season that season. He saved actually 85% of all shots on target, which is a phenomenal number. I mean, I think anything over sort of 75 is decent. 85 is phenomenal, and but by other measures though, he played pretty well and he kept his place, even when Lennon came back. And so when we started the 1920 season last season, Bain was in the team. But remember, it was very obvious and made very obvious, and that's something I'll touch on a bit later, that Lennon was looking for another #1. And Bain had a terrible start to the season, and his save percentage rate went down from 85% to 53. So essentially he was nearly letting in 1 in every 2 shots that were on target. And so when Foster came in, and obviously we know that Foster had a great season last season, especially in the key games, his save percentage shot up to 76%. And now if we look at this season, you've got you've got Barkas being brought in as ostensibly as the #1 for a lot of transfer money. So you'd think he's the main man. Bain, nevertheless, had to start the season because, as usual, we're waiting to get that business done. And really, Barkas, he actually missed a game through injury, and then Bain was put in and kept his place. But long story short, both of them have got. Barkas has got a save percentage of 52%, and Bain's got a save percentage of 45%. I mean, these are horrible numbers, right? But they don't tell you everything about goalkeeping performance. They really can actually reflect more about how the team's performing, in all honesty. What we need to look at is expected goals, because that really tells you, which saves should the goalkeeper have made depending on the shot quality. Yeah. So save percentage is interesting in the sense of it. I would classify save percentage as the same as, let's call it, possession and total shots. It tells you something, but it really doesn't give you a full story as to whether actually somebody's performing well or not. It's just another piece of information that you can use to contextualize.
Can I just hop in on that?
Of course.
So for a team like Celtic, and they've been dominating for so long domestically, I know it will change for the European form, but for something like save percentage, because Celtic would be considered the dominant team in most of the domestic games, bar 1 or 2, you're only giving up a few chances. Therefore, your save percentage, you want that to be much higher than 50%. You want that in the range of 75 to 90%, surely.
You do, but of course that's not what's happened this season. So if we go on to, what is the actual expected goals of the saves made? So really, essentially what we're saying here is how many expected goals worth of goals has the goalkeeper saved per 90 minutes? And if you look at these stats, really what that shows is it accentuates the fact that probably Bain was keeping out, and again, Bain didn't play in the European games, the harder games, but Bain was keeping out around about a fraction of more shots than than Gordon was over 90 minutes. And then under Lennon, when again I think it was the fact that it was very obvious that Forster was going to be brought in. Bain, I think, on that basis, is really a confidence player, and I think his confidence got shot, and his percentage of expected goal he was keeping out the net really went down almost over a goal. Almost a 0.15 goal a game, which is quite a big percentage drop, really. And then Forster came in and performed much better than Bain or Gordon had over the last 2 seasons in that regard. But if you look at this season, Bain actually is saving about 0.76 of a goal a game. But of course, why is that? Because he saved 2 penalties, and we're looking at a very small sample. So those two penalties have massively skewed that stat. So again, you sort of think, well, what is this really telling me? Barkas is performing about the same as Gordon, a regressing Gordon was, 2 seasons ago. But again, to your point, Enda, he's probably facing an awful lot more shots, and therefore he's probably keeping more out in that sense. So what does that all mean, really? What I want to kind of conclude on this one is to really compare actually the goals conceded versus the expected goals conceded. So again, without getting too complicated, with goalkeepers, we look at what's called post-shot expected goals. So this is really looking at the number that of expected goal, which is the shot is actually obviously not being blocked. It's on target. Therefore, the goalkeeper has to either do something or let it in. So it's a slightly higher number than the expected goal when it leaves somebody's foot. Because when it leaves somebody's foot, all the factors like, it could get blocked, it may go wide or whatever, are factored in. But once you know it's on target, then the expected goal level actually goes up. So with goalkeepers, we use that post-shot expected goal. And so comparing that to actual goals conceded, again, very simply, if Enda, you were the goalkeeper and the team was conceding a goal a game, and the expected goal said you should be conceding a goal a game, you're pretty much performing, pretty average, really. But you're no worse than average, right? You're expected to concede a goal, and the stats say you're conceding a goal. So what does it say about the Celtic goalkeepers? Again, very clearly, in 18-19, Bain deserved to keep his place because Gordon was letting in more goals than he was expected to, and Bain would have been expected to concede 0.6 of a goal a game and was actually conceding 0.37. So that's pretty good, right? He's actually, you can see he's adding value at this point. If you switch to last season, Bain's numbers basically flipped. But again, he seemed to be playing some of the harder games at the beginning of the season in Europe, and his expected goals conceded was over 1. It was like 1.13, 1 basically, but he's actually conceding 1.13. So when Forster came in, again, he flipped that. He was expected to concede, 0.9 basically goals per game, and he actually conceded around about 0.7. So again, you can see there's a significant, none of these are point numbers, but if you add them up over a 50-game season, that equates to a decent chunk of goals.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's flip to this season, and very interestingly, for both Barkas and Bain, they're basically conceding roughly the number of goals that you'd expect them to based on the quality of the shots that they're facing. Okay, so again with Bain has played in some of the more difficult games. I mean, and this is a reflection of where Celtic are. Celtic are being expected to concede 2 goals a game in the games that Bain has played in, and he's actually conceded about 1.93. So he's pretty much roughly on par with what's expected. With Barkas, it's the same. It's about 0.9 either way. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the goalkeepers are performing roughly as expected. They're not overperforming like Forster was. So, you've got the issue here. You've got the sort of, let's call it the Tierney effect, where, for Bolingoli, for Taylor, for Laxalt, their biggest problem is they're not Kieran Tierney. Right? Kieran Tierney is a 25 to 30 million pound player who they're replacing. And guess what? They're not as good as him. And similarly, neither Barkas or Bain are probably as good as Forster was, and are not as performing as well. But actually, are they performing to such an extent that you're going to keep dropping them and further eroding their confidence? No, no, you're not. And actually, is the reason that Celtic are conceding goals because of flagrant goalkeeping errors? No, it's not. The reason is because of the volume and the quality of the chances that the team are giving up that the goalkeeper then has to deal with. The goalkeeper is the last line of defence. As we showed last week, the opposition are getting more chances and they're getting better quality chances and they're finishing them.
Yeah, and where that really comes in is the European games, because Celtic are a squad that come from a country and a league that has a lower deficiency rate than the rest of the clubs that they're coming up against, like in Italy and Germany and England. So you need your players to be overperforming to their XG to do anything in it. James, I'm going to bring you in here because I know that you really have hammered home the impact that Fraser Forster had on Celtic in the European games, especially last season. So what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I had a couple of points just to add to Alan's comments. The first is and again, this is just to clarify, and I only know this, Alan, because I just looked at it yesterday. So this is not me calling you out on anything, but I believe Bain played in the Valencia games. I was surprised. I didn't remember that having happened.
No, fair enough.
Yeah,
I've probably forgotten. I didn't look at the games individually. I was looking at the season stats. But yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so I think that was the only European games he played, and you're right, because he had taken over, and that was after the winter break, obviously. The only other thing relative to Bain is I believe, and again, I might be wrong here, but I believe he got hurt in the summer before before the Cluj game, and then he ultimately was not even in the squad for a period of time after Forster came in because of that injury. So I think there's a possibility he was playing injured, which obviously could contribute to how horrible he was during that stretch in the qualifier. So again, I just want to add that as kind of a context. Relative to Forster, so the argument that I've been making really for a year now is that if you take last year's campaign and kind of do it excluding Forster's value added, it would have been a very different assessment of the season, in my judgment. We would have lost the cup final. So we wouldn't have had the trouble. We would have lost a final with Rangers. And we very unlikely would have won the group and possibly could have finished even third in the Europa League group. If you look at Forster's performances in those 5 group stage games, he didn't play in the kind of the dead rubber match against Cluj, the last 2-0 loss at Cluj. But if you look at the other 5 games, his performances were exceptional. And I think that's, one of the things I try to do is I look at averages, but then I try to decompose kind of the sequencing and the variance of how performances unfold. So if you look at Forster's data for last season, it was exceptional, but he had a really bad game against Copenhagen in the 3-1 loss. And the 3 chances that he let in, I think, are probably the areas that he's weakest in, kind of coming out off the line, trying to stop low shots. To me, that, again, that's just anecdotal. That seems to be an issue that he had. Whereas in those 5 group stage games, he was just unbelievable. I mean, and I think we'll show some of these charts on YouTube, but I did basically historical distributions on Barkas, on Forster, and then I threw in David Marshall just as a comparison, because I think there's some yearning for Marshall now in some quarters, and even some talk that he may have been a preferred keeper by somebody in Celtic, maybe, let's say, over Barkas. And so if you look at the distribution of performances over the last 5 years for these keepers, Forster has clearly shown the ability to put off what I'll call game-winning performances, kind of, as Alan talked about, a goals against, a post-shot XG versus goals conceded, where he saved, let's say, 1.5 or more goals in a single game. That happened over 10% of the time in his performances dating back to 15-16. Which is, Barkas has only done that in 4% of his performances. Marshall's done it in over 8%, so he's kind of in between. The problem, that if you look at the other side of the distribution, which is, horrible performances where you're, maybe the keeper has a really bad day and, lets in a lot of goals that maybe he shouldn't have. Forster also has a little more volatility there. Now he again was facing higher competition in the Premier League, so there's some factors that need to be accounted for there. The thing with Marshall is his is more than double the rate of Barkas. So Barkas has been a consistent keeper in his career. He hasn't shown that upside that I've talked about, and that game-winning performances. And two of Forster's, I believe, two of his 7 just world-beating performances since 15-16 were last season. One was in the cup final, where I think he outperformed the XG against him.
7 saves, I think.
Yeah, and it was well over 1.5 in the XG that he outperformed. And the other one was in Lazio away.
I think that's what we would call that as a clutch player, essentially. And it comes across because people remember Forster for the Barcelona game, for example. We've referenced that a couple of times. In layman's terms, what we're essentially saying here is that Forster has that in him. Barkas would not have saved all the shots that Forster saved in the Barcelona game, because he doesn't or hasn't done that previously and hasn't shown it across his career that he has that ability to outperform his XG.
Yeah, it's not that it can't happen or it won't happen. Again, I haven't done, I don't have access to data. I mean, I don't run regressions on development curves from keepers from age 20 up through. I mean, this is the kind of sophisticated modeling that can happen or should be happening at clubs to look at whether that's something that tends to be innate early and displayed early, or is that a skill that can be acquired over time. But yeah, it's funny. I mean, Marshall's performance against the Czech Republic for Scotland, for example, that the distributions I created included all senior matches because I wanted to get at the biggest sample as possible. And that's one of his worldly games in his, and he has, about 2% fewer than Forster, was that recent performance against the Czech Republic. So I think if you look at the let's call it the legend of Lenin in Europe, Forster has a big part in that. And, if you're running a style of play that's a little bit more chaotic, less controlled, more direct, it helps to have a keeper at the back that's going to cover up for some of that if you have some rough games. And that certainly took place to a significant degree with Forster last year. And I think that's part of the problem now is we don't have that security blanket at the back to bail out the team when some of that chaos breaks against us. And that's, in my judgment, a big differentiator. If you look at the European campaigns under Rodgers, for example, and I just want to touch upon something. I think there's an easy way to kind of conceptualize this statistically. If you think about the number of goals that are scored, you can kind of break that down into 3 components that Alan talked about. There's kind of the XG, which is the quality of the chance before the player shoots, that Alan talked about. There's the skill of the shooter, kind of the finishing component, which is where do they put it on goal? Are they a good shooter? And then the last piece is the keeper skill component. So you think of those kind of the 3 components of the difference between, kind of XG and then the actual goals scored. And what we see, what I see if I break out that data, is under the Rodgers period, we faced teams that were really good in Champions League, guys like Cavani and Neymar and Messi. So a big chunk of, let's say that 7-0 Barcelona game, Rodgers' first group stage game, was actually finishing. I mean, the XG was around 3. So the pre-shot XG was around 3. The post shot was around 5. So that was pretty good. And then Gordon didn't have a great day, and 2 of that, the other 2, so kind of 3 was chance creation, 2 was finishing, and 2 was Gordon not having a great day. So that's kind of how I conceptualize this. And if you think about that through the Rodgers campaigns, that was consistent in the Champions League, where that we faced teams that were finishing well, keepers were maybe not quite up to that level. But the underlying chance creation that we surrendered under Rodgers was not bad, even in the Champions League. Like even the 7-1 against PSG, XG was just above 2. So again, if you flip that, and if you look at recent campaigns under Lennon, we've had that benefit last season of Forster, which basically he's the only keeper in that period of time that had outperformed their post-shot XG. So Bain didn't in Europe, Gordon didn't. In fact, they surrendered a little bit more, in goals, or in Gordon's case, particularly in 18-19, a lot more, or even in 17-18 as well in Champions League. And so that's a big difference. And that's a matter of the level of keepers Alan talked about. I mean, he's just a better keeper. He's shown that ability. And at that level, when you're facing sharpshooters, let's say, or better finishers, and then you're getting teams that are carving us open more, and we're having the chaos in front, it makes sense when you decompose things in that way that we're suffering these problems. And I think the big thing to draw from all this is that it's not the keeper's fault to the degree probably that I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people are kind of drawing that conclusion. And, quite frankly, with the problems that we're having, Forster would probably make things better if we brought him in on a loan. But,
papering over cracks, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe we lose 3-1 to Sparta instead of 4-1. It's not enough.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about the goals that we conceded in that game from inside the 6-yard box. I mean, you don't care whether you're Foster or you're Barkas or you're Bain, you're not saving those, right? Because structurally, the whole defence is disintegrated in front of you. You're not going to save them. I mean, so listen, James. The point that all the points you made are excellent. There's no doubt Forster's been an elite level keeper for Celtic, right? So you're Neil Lennon, right? And yeah, I'm sure you wanted to get Forster in this season. You've not got him. You've spent a lot of money on a goalkeeper. Surely to God you make it work. Surely to God you fill the guy with confidence. Surely to God you say, look, you're my number one. You are the man, right? We're all behind you. You're going to take time to settle in. You're going to maybe make some mistakes. We're going to play a bit more open this season. So, that's not on you. Surely you would kind of give the guy confidence rather than end up with the situation that we're in, where we've got two goalkeepers whose confidence is shot, A, because of what they've seen before them, and B, because neither of them feels that they've got the backing of the manager, or so it seems to me anyway. So whether Foster's great or not, you still do your best to remedy that situation, because you just got to accept you've not got Forster.
Well, yeah. and to build, and this has been, my word of the season, incoherent. So it's building a style of play and a system that is practical and reasonable within the context of the strengths and weaknesses of your players. So, we brought in a keeper like Barkas, which, the scouting reports I've read ahead of time, and, for example, the Cynic, Christian Wolf, and Stephen Russell, I'm a patron there, and they put out a really good report on Barkas back over the summer that has proven to be pretty accurate in strengths and weaknesses. And, one of his big strengths is ball playing. Well, I don't know how that makes sense, because that's also one of the things that Bain, excelled at under Rodgers. And then when we replaced Barkas with Bain, all of a sudden we're kicking the ball long, and we had Duffy in the middle. So we're not clearly with Bain, that mix of Bain kicking long and Duffy playing in the center of a 3, the priority wasn't playing out from the back. Well, then what the hell were we doing ever bringing a guy like Barkas in, where one of his big strengths is playing out from the back? And he's been terrific in that sense. I mean, I think, he's made some dubious mistakes, but that happens. I mean, generally his throwing and I think his distribution's been pretty good.
90%. His pass completion rate is 90%, which for a goalkeeper is astonishing, because there's a lot of long goal kicks in there. That's all passes. That's open play and set play. To put that into context, Forster's pass completion was below 70%. In fact, Gordon, when he was trying really hard, Bain in his good season got around about 75%. But Barkas 90% pass completion. That's exceptional. But like you say, he's just the wrong. He's playing in the wrong team in that sense.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that Christian Wolf and Stephen Russell pointed out, which I think has proven out to be fairly true, is some issues with footwork and long distance shooting. We certainly saw that on the free kick against Milan. And I also noticed that just anecdotally. I mean, that's the other thing, going back to distributions and sequencing. So overall, Barkas, but he had a really good game against Ross County. where it was close to 1.5 in expected post-shot XG, where he didn't concede any goals, or we didn't, Celtic didn't concede any goals. And his 2 performances against Milan are actually, if you look at his horrible performances, his whole career so far, there's 4 of them. And 2 of them were against Milan in the last 6 weeks at Celtic. So if you think about, recency bias, anchoring, it's understandable why a lot of the support are saying this guy's not up to snuff. But again, I didn't understand the dropping either. I didn't understand why we're bringing Bain in to kick long when he's not particularly good at that, it seems. It just, again, back to this issue of coherence, and I don't understand a lot of the decisions we make relative to players, systems, strengths, weaknesses. And this is just another example.
And that's essentially become the theme of the Huddle Breakdown over the last couple of years, or a couple of weeks, is that
like years.
It feels like years. Honestly, the last 3 weeks has felt like 3 seasons all packed into one. Even for a general SPFL season, it just seems absolutely mental what's been going on over the last couple of weeks. But so it basically ties into everything that we've been saying, is that the players that we brought in and the system that we're playing, none of it matches together correctly in order for these players to play their best and be confident, because confidence is something that Neil Lennon has brought up time and time again over the last couple of weeks. And it does tie into the performances, because if your goalkeeper isn't confident in what the defender is going to do, then he's going to be a little bit more edgy and a little bit nervous going into the games. And likewise with the defenders, if they don't have confidence in their goalkeeper, that if they make a mistake, that the goalkeeper is going to save that, then they'll start to overcompensate for him as well. So it all ties together, and it all has led to what is essentially the worst period of Celtic's performances over the last 10, 15 years, maybe even 20 years. So hopefully we get some performances over the next couple of weeks. One thing that you can say is that every single bit of reporting coming out of Celtic right at the minute is that the players are behind Neil Lennon. So what does changing him do, and will that make a difference? It's hard to know what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. Hopefully Neil Lennon can get the players fit, first of all, if they're not fit, and secondly, hopefully he can start getting some coherence into that side. But we are right out of time for this week on the Huddle Breakdown. Thanks to everyone who listened so far, and if you have subscribed, thank you. If you haven't, just hit the subscribe button below on YouTube or on Spotify, wherever you're listening, and you'll get notified every time there's a new Huddle Breakdown going up as well. Alan, James, thanks again.
Thanks, Enda.
We'll chat to you next week.